Sefton narrowboat operates under the charitable arm of the Savini Group.
We've just been funded by UK Heritage Fund and DCMS, and we're really proud to be able to now go forward and offer educational trips showcasing the heritage of Liverpool's waterways. We start our journey at the Titanic Hotel and we come right the way through Princess Dock, the Central Dock area. We come right past the Liver building. People say when they come aboard they've never seen that side of Liverpool before. A lot of people don't know it exists even. As you take your journey through, you'll learn the history of the docks, the history of the canal system. I think it just gives something back really to the communities.
Liverpool had the world's first enclosed wet dock. And this was started in 1709 and opened to shipping in 1715. Before that, the way of loading and unloading ships was to run the ship onto the beach and then load it and unload it. And you had a time when the tide was in and tide was out, and it would take a month or so to unload a ship, a month or so to fill it up again with goods. So when you had a wet dock, that trapped the water in. The ship would lie against the side of the dock. You can see behind me the sides of docks. And you could load and unload a ship more quickly. So you're perhaps talking about a week to load it and unload it. This meant ships could turn around and get on with their business quicker. And very soon, Liverpool became a port to come to because of this speed, because you could load and unload ships more quickly. It started to eclipse other ports, like Lancaster and Fleetwood and Whitehaven and places like this. In 1824, Liverpool appointed a chap called Jesse Hartley, a guy from Yorkshire, to be the world's first full-time salaried dock engineer. And quite remarkable really, because at the time he hadn't built a dock. He built railways and canals and things like that, but he'd never built a dock. And he came and dramatically expanded the whole dock system. He increased the size of the docks by 5 times. By the 1850s, the British government's single biggest source of income was the customs house in Liverpool. Let's make no mistake about it, Liverpool was the second city of empire. It was the third most important port in the world. London was the most important, followed by New York, followed by Liverpool. During the Second World War, Liverpool was the biggest port in the world. There was more cargo coming through Liverpool. The Blitz on Liverpool was no mistake. The Germans were trying to destroy the port, trying to stop the goods coming in. Every single drop of fuel that came into Britain during the Second World War came in through Liverpool. The importance of Liverpool as a port, the importance of the dock system cannot be overemphasised.
Primarily, our boat is used for charities and community groups to come on board, take some respite from their everyday lives, and we find that it really improves people's health and well-being, and they just really enjoy seeing the heritage of this city.
Well, the Docklands Trail is going to tell the history of the North Liverpool docks, which includes mostly Bootle docks, our main form of interest in this project. And hopefully by starting the trail here at Stanley Dock, we'll attract people from this end and tempt them further up toward Bootle End to educate them in what Bootle has done in terms of Docklands history. This site at the moment is an overall vision of our Docklands Trail as we propose it to be. In the first container we are highlighting the history and the future of Bramley-Moore Dock. Green container, it's a general historical view of 6 sites in particular, 6 docks in particular, with the overall vision of the North Liverpool and Bootle docks. In the third container we have the builders of the docks, which is most important. That's the North Liverpool docks from Waterloo up to, well, Seaforth, but mainly concentrating on the works of Jesse Hartley. And finally we have the last container is the Canal and River Trust, exhibiting the history of canals, which is more historic than the North Liverpool docks. The partnership between the Docklands Trail and the Pride of Sefton will introduce more people here than we would normally reach out to. For educational purposes, it will bring the kids in that we want here to learn the history on the sites where it's actually happened, which is far more meaningful than just reading about it in a book.
We're going to be looking, as part of the journey on the boat, at Man Island. Everybody knows Man Island. It was an artificial island created when they built George's Dock. Man Island was named after people called Man, M-A-N-N. And there was father and son who had their business on there, and both of them were involved in the slave trade. They were both masters of ships involved in the transatlantic slave trade from about 1660, when sugar and tobacco started to come in. That was one leg of the so-called triangular slave trade. And this went down from Liverpool, or from Europe, to the coast of West Africa, across to the Americas, be it the West Indies, Central or Southern America, and then back to Europe with goods like sugar and tobacco and cotton and things like that.
In Liverpool, ships would be fitted out, and those kind of goods that they were trading with West Africans would be put on board. And when they got to West Africa, those goods would be exchanged for people, and these people would be taken to the Americas. And lots of Liverpool ships actually went to the Caribbean, but South America and also North America are involved in this trade as well. And this is a really difficult journey on these ships, so 6 to 8 weeks in really treacherous conditions, packed really close together and forced to wear things like shackles and neck irons. They're really uncomfortable. So if you think about how many people will be crammed on board these ships, the conditions are really unsanitary, and lots of people died on the journey.
And Liverpool was involved in the actual slave trade from about 1700 until it was stopped by Act of Parliament in 1807. And in that time, they carried about 1.5 million Africans into a life of slavery.
Now that's a massive amount of people, and by the last couple of decades they were dominating the trade, so overtaking places like Bristol and London, and had a real chunk of the European trade as well. So transatlantic slavery massively changed Liverpool from being a really small fishing port to expanding it to a global power.
It wasn't uncommon for children, African children, to come here. They would be perhaps taught some English on the ship by the captain or one of the officers, and then come to Liverpool, and it's very distressing. They were sold as servants. They weren't slaves. They were dressed in fine clothes, and they might carry a lady's silk handkerchief. And I say it's distressing. These were kids of 8 or 10. They didn't know where they were. They didn't know where their mums and dads were. They'd never been in a ship. They'd never been away from their village in Africa. And all of a sudden, they're in Liverpool.
It's a really difficult history to think about as well, but it's so important that we learn about it, because it has so many lasting repercussions. So if we think about the ideas that they used to justify transatlantic slavery, they were saying things like those West African people were uneducated, they weren't as intelligent, they didn't feel pain in the same way, which we all know now is all ridiculous. But at the time, for centuries, those ideas were pushed and pushed, and people started to believe them, and people bought into them because it allowed them to make massive amounts of profit.
Although the government stopped the transatlantic slave trade in 1807, and quite a number of other places did, the Americans stopped it, and a number of the European countries, that wasn't the end of it at all, not by a long way. Slave ships still went out from Liverpool. You can tell this because they increased the penalty for breaking the law. It started out that if the Navy intercepted a ship with kidnapped Africans on board, there was a fine of £100 per person on board the ship. So it's a big fine. That wasn't where it ended. They changed that from a fine at one stage to transportation to Australia for 7 years if you were caught in command of a slave ship. For a short time, they increased the penalty to capital punishment. You could be hanged for doing it. If the slave trade had stopped, they wouldn't have had to increase the penalties. The last ship that left Liverpool that was intercepted by the Navy off the coast of West Africa was the Allegra, and that sailed from Liverpool in 1862 with the Spanish captain and the Spanish flag. When it was captured by the Navy, the naval officer's writing up his log, and at the bottom of the entry for the log, in a rather bored way, he said, the only thing Spanish about that ship was the flag. So it was a Liverpool ship involved in the slave trade, 1862. Liverpool is a city built on slavery. There's no getting away from that. And we need to accept that, and we need to talk about it so that we can understand it better, perhaps. Not try and brush it under the carpet, not try and pretend it didn't happen. We've got to think about this and talk about it.
It's about raising awareness and educating not just the youth but all generations, I think, to make a change. And the piece that we performed today, it's called They Don't Really Care About Us. So to bring it here today is really relevant, you know, as an expression of educating people but also raising awareness. And I know that we've looked at slavery and different things today. I feel Liverpool and the city region is a melting pot of diverse cultures, history and heritage. So it's about giving people a rounded education, and I feel like with the change that the world is going through, it's about educating people of all different backgrounds, you know, with faiths, beliefs, different culture, history, heritage. I encourage everyone to come down and take part in the Pride of Sefton, you know, admire the canal boat, get on it, but also take time to listen, to read, ask questions. I feel like the key to making change is education.
We're here in the Collingwood dock, and back in the 19th century, Liverpool was one of the largest ports in the entire world. And these quays here, they would have been importing cotton, corn, timber, leather goods, fur goods, tobacco, sugar from every corner of the earth. Back in old glory days, long since forgotten, the flags here were smothered in snowy white cotton, soft as a carpet beneath merchant feet. King Cotton was plenty, King Cotton was cheap. It came by the Mersey, it came by the seas, white canvas aloft in the westering breeze, by Liverpool sailors, nimble and yar, tough as mahogany, weathered as tar. It came from the rivers, it came from the mud, it came from the kick and the stick and the blood. It came from the work line, the whip, the plantation. It came from the fracture and breaking of nations. For cotton is gentle, fragile and light. Cotton is pure and pristine and white. But the commerce of cotton, darker than death, would barter your soul and crush your last breath. It went by the engine, the steam and the rail. It went by the hundredweight bale over bale. It went by Manchester, Bury and Preston, Blackburn and Bolton and Darwin and Nelson, where there's brass for the boss and poor spinning Jenny worked hour by long hour for less than 1 penny, where the air is so thick it smothered the lung and the thundering loom drowned the Lancashire tongue. Cotton by bowl, by bag and by bale, for smocks and for shirts, for duckcloth and sail, cotton for mills, for ships, for plantations, enriching mill owners, impoverishing nations, cotton for tyranny, hardship and slavery, cotton for unions, resistance and bravery. Back in its glory days, long since forgotten, it came by the Mersey, that snowy white cotton. Even more important were the people who came. This dock here was where the Irish migrants came over in the year of the Irish famine, beginning in 1847 through to the 1850s. They came in huge numbers. In 1847, the Liverpool police counted the people coming through here, and they counted 300,000 Irish people. And those people who came through here would have encountered something they'd never come across before. They'd never been to a big city before. So they would have come out of the Clarence Dock gates. They would have encountered people speaking Polish and German and a type of English that they didn't really understand. They were people who were easy victims for the con men that you found in Liverpool, who would grab their bag, even though they could carry it themselves, and would charge them for carrying that bag, who would sell them things they didn't need, who would sell them American currency, which was of no use, who would charge them for booking into a hostel. And lots of them settled in the little streets around the dock. They didn't really get much further. And they found work there. In the 19th century, early 20th century, there were thousands of unskilled Irish workers who came to Liverpool because you could get work there along the docks. They mainly did the loading and unloading of ships, which was a very dangerous job. The first year they actually counted the number of casualties was in the late 1890s, and in that first year they recorded 41,000 injuries on the docks and 89 people, dockers, who had met their death either because a crane snapped or they were walking on a narrow gangplank and fell into the water. Lots of Irish women took jobs as street traders, which again was unskilled or semi-skilled work. They would be selling fruit and vegetables, fish, bits of wood they chopped up that people could use for their fire. I suppose the most famous of those was Annie Garvey, who had a little hut at the pier head. And in 1906, the local parish priest bought Annie a new hut because she lived at the pier head. And the reason he bought her the new hut was that she was 100 years old at that time. And Annie was selling toffees and sweets and marbles to people from her hut on the pier head. Why was she living in a hut at the pier head? Well, you could lose your pitch. In the early 1900s, the ferries were coming into Liverpool every morning, like the tide. Thousands of people coming across from Birkenhead to work in Liverpool, and the same thousands going back again that night when they were going back home. And they would come across those stalls at the pier head where Annie was there selling her produce. Others were selling newspapers and magazines and fruit and vegetables. There were people doing card tricks. There were people polishing your shoes. There were musicians there. There was a barrel organ there. It was a real hive of activity in those days. But to give you an idea of the poverty of the time, you did have things called the bread riots in Liverpool, which occurred on days whenever the wind blew in the wrong direction and ships didn't come in. It was only a matter of days before families ran out of food. And that was whenever you had incidents of people breaking into the bakeries and the bread shops to find something to eat. But then in the second half of the 19th century, there were so many Irish people settling in Liverpool that they took over the whole of the north end of the city, which was some streets were 80-90% Irish born when you look at them in the census. The people who were worst off were those who lived in the cellars that were dark and damp, that had been closed down by public health but were reopened again, which were flooded for much of the year, which were cold, which were breeding places for disease such as typhus and cholera. So it was a very tough life with the men trying to get unskilled work on the docks. The dockers had to stand every morning in hundreds in what were called cages. They were fenced in, and a foreman would come along and pick who would get work that day, depending on whether ships had come in or not. And you would get a half day's work or a day's work, but you didn't have any permanent contract of employment, and you didn't know if you're going to work again tomorrow. Those who carried the heavy timber, like tropical timber like teak, they would have a hardened scab on their shoulder, and they could do that work all day. But if you weren't accustomed to that work, you couldn't manage it. So when we were researching recently, looking for Liverpool families whose roots go back to the 1840s, one of the things we found was that there are lots of people in Liverpool who come from Caribbean and Irish backgrounds, or African and Irish backgrounds, or Chinese and Irish backgrounds. And what was the reason for this? Well, in the 19th century, Liverpool was a multicultural city when other cities in Britain were not. But one of the things the Irish found in Liverpool was that in a small Irish parish back at home, the parish priest would be very powerful, and you couldn't just marry who you wanted to. Whereas here in Liverpool, it was much more free and easy in Liverpool, and people would meet up and fall in love and rear a family, and they could be from all sorts of backgrounds. Because we must remember the importance of that sea-growing culture in Liverpool. James Larkin, the famous trade union leader, went down to the waterfront not far from here one day, stowed on a ship, was caught, was forced to go down into the bottom of the ship to shovel coal to keep their boiler going, travelled to South America, travelled to New Orleans, travelled to the Caribbean, and found a Liverpool ship that took him back from America back to Liverpool again in time for his 19th birthday. So that shows you what Liverpool was like in those days. Many of those thousands of Irish migrants who came through the Clarence Dock, a short distance away at the Waterloo Dock, they would embark for North America, Canada and the United States, along with people from Poland, Lithuania, Russia, Germany. And getting on the ship was not an easy matter. They would stand on the quayside here. The captain would first of all take the cargo in that went in at the bottom of the ship, and then the passengers, so anxious to get a good spot on the boat for their 6-week voyage to America, would scramble up the sides of the ship, would be pulled on by members of the crew, would sometimes drop their bags, sometimes people fell in the water. And when they got on the ship, what awaited them there? They were in extremely cramped conditions. The captain would take the boat out into the middle of the river. He would check for stowaways on the boat. The Liverpool first mates often called out the names in a kind of a rhyming way. They'd say, Joshua Brown, come on down. William Jones, show your bones. They would call them out in rhyme, and then they would check if they had enough water. Lots of street traders were still working on the boat. They'd come on with the passengers. The Everton toffee ladies had to be rounded up and put on a rowing boat to be sent back over to the shore. And only when all that had been done did those poor people set off for that long voyage to Canada and the United States. In the United States, where there were no landlords, there was no crown, there was low taxation, you could get yourself, you didn't have to pay anything to a landlord or to an established church. Home of the brave and land of the free.
We have a fantastic voluntary programme at the Pride of Sefton. All our crew members are volunteers, so they come along, they join like-minded individuals. It improves their health and mental well-being, and they also learn new practical skills, and we're really proud to be able to support a great group of volunteers. Without the funding from the Heritage Fund, we wouldn't have been able to begin this project at all. So we're really lucky. Every time we come on the boat, every time we have a new historian or a new partnership, there's new things we learn, and we want to make sure that these facts aren't lost and that we find them important links from our past to our future.
you.